6 years ago, Yeo Soo-bin vanished from Carrie Rempel's life, leaving her with a shattered heart and a secret he wasn't supposed to find out. To satisfy a ruthless family dynasty and protect his claim to the throne, he did the unthinkable. He married a woman from his own world, Carrie's wealthy, socially acceptable Asian stepsister. But at a high-stakes family reunion meant to solidify his power, the mask of the cold Mafia boss shatters. Standing in the shadows is the woman he was forced to reject, and beside her, a 6-year-old boy with his father's lethal eyes. Now, Soo-bin must choose between the empire he built and the heir he never knew existed. If you love intense second-chance romance, interracial mafia drama, and the satisfaction of a rejected woman taking her rightful place, subscribe and stay tuned, because the Yeo family's perfect union is about to burn. Carrie waited 6 hours before making the call. She had spent those hours pacing her small apartment. The image of Soo-bin's face at the reunion burned into her retinas. He had been standing on that marble dais, his hand placed formally over her stepsister's, the picture of Mafia royalty, until he saw Leo. The glass in Soo-bin's hand hadn't just shattered. He had crushed it with his bare palms, his blood dripping onto the white lace of his bride's gown as he stared at the boy who shouldn't exist. Carrie was done with the whispers. She was done with being the mistress her stepsister claimed she was, and she was done with the curated lies Soo-bin had used to exile her to the margins of his life. She wanted the truth, the real reason he had traded her for a crown. He answered before the first ring finished. "The boy," he rasped, his voice sounding like it had been dragged over gravel. "Is he mine? He's the heir your family told you was impossible," Carrie whispered, her voice like steel. "Come alone. Not for me, but for your son." He didn't wait an hour. He was at her door in 8 minutes, his tuxedo still stained with his bride's wine and his own blood. The air in the Grand Hyatt Seoul's ballroom was thick with the scent of lilies and the stifling weight of expectation. Carrie Rempel stood at the far edge of the room, her fingers curled tightly around a glass of sparkling water she hadn't touched. She felt like an ink blot on a pristine white canvas. Every guest in the room was draped in silk and tradition, a sea of neutral tones and whispered Korean dialects that made her feel more like a ghost than a guest. She shouldn't have come. She knew at the moment she stepped onto the marble floor. But her stepsister, Kim Soo-bin, had insisted with that sharp, saccharine sweetness that characterized their relationship. "It's a family reunion, Carrie. Even if you're only my stepsister, it would look bad if you weren't there to see my husband's promotion toast." Beside Carrie, 6-year-old Leo tugged at the collar of his tiny navy suit. He was being uncharacteristically quiet, his dark, almond-shaped eyes scanning the room with a gravity that always made Carrie's heart ache. He had his father's eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing. Then, the room went silent. Yeo Soo-bin stepped onto the velvet-draped dais. He was exactly as Carrie remembered, yet terrifyingly different. The soft boy who had once traced the lines of her palms in a cramped apartment 6 years ago was gone. In his place stood a man carved from ice and shadow. His jaw was a sharp, lethal line, his black hair swept back with surgical precision. He wore power like a second skin, a dark tailored suit that marked him as the undisputed heir to the Yeo syndicate. Standing beside him, looking like a porcelain doll, was Kim Soo-bin. She wore a traditional hanbok modernized with diamonds, her hand resting possessively on his arm. She was the woman his family had chosen, the woman who fit the world he was forced to return to. Soo-bin raised a crystal flute of vintage champagne. His voice was deep, a resonant baritone that vibrated in the pit of Carrie's stomach, bringing back a flood of memories she had spent half a decade trying to drown. "To the future of the Yeo family," he began, his gaze fixed on the back of the room, avoiding the faces of the sycophants before him. "To the legacy we build today, and the traditions that ensure our blood remains." The words died in his throat. His gaze had shifted, drifting toward the shadows near the exit where Carrie stood. Tumben just slowed down. It stopped. The champagne flute remained frozen halfway to his lips. Carrie felt the breath leave her lungs as Soo Bin's eyes locked onto hers. The controlled mask he had worn since entering the room didn't just slip, it disintegrated. But he wasn't looking at Carrie. Not anymore. His eyes had dropped to the small boy standing at her hip. Leo had tilted his head, looking up at the man on the stage with a calm, observant expression that was a mirror image of the man holding the glass. The resemblance was an atmospheric shift, a silent thunderclap that shook the foundations of the room. Soo Bin's hand began to tremble. It was a minute movement, invisible to everyone but the woman who had once slept against his chest. His knuckles turned white, the tension in his grip reaching a breaking point. Clink! The sound of the crystal flute shattering against the marble floor echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. Champagne sprayed across the hem of Kim Soo Bin's white gown, but the Mafia boss didn't flinch. He didn't look down at the mess. He didn't look at his bride, who let out a small, sharp gasp of surprise. He took a step forward, the broken glass crunching beneath his handmade Italian leather shoes. His pale, cool-toned skin had gone even paler, his focused gaze narrowing with a terrifying, haunted intensity. "Subinda," Kim Soo Bin whispered, her bright, unaware smile finally faltering as she reached for his arm. "What is it? Are you ill?" He didn't hear her. He couldn't. His entire world had narrowed down to the small, beige-skinned boy who looked like he had been plucked out of a Yeo family portrait from 30 years ago. Carrie felt the blood rush to her head, a cold panic rising. This was the moment she had feared for 6 years, the moment the lion realized he had a cub in the wild. She saw the way Soo Bin's father, the patriarch sitting in the front row, followed his son's gaze. She saw the confusion turning into sharp, predatory interest on the old man's face. "Leo," Carrie whispered, her voice a ghost of a sound. "We have to go." She reached for Leo's hand, her movement breaking the trance. On the stage, Soo Bin made a move to jump down, his hand reaching out as if he could grab the air between them. "Carrie," he called out. It wasn't a command. It was a plea, broken, raw, and completely out of place in the sterile luxury of the Hyatt. The room erupted into whispers. The perfect union, the carefully curated legacy of the Yeo family, was crumbling in real time. Kim Soo Bin stood frozen, her hand still hovering where her husband's arm had been, her eyes darting between the black woman in the simple dress and the husband who had just forgotten she existed. Carrie didn't wait to see the fallout. She scooped Leo up, ignoring the protest of her racing heart, and pushed through the heavy oak doors of the ballroom. She ran through the lobby, the sound of her own heels clicking like a countdown. She had spent 6 years being the woman they rejected. She had accepted the silence. She had accepted the exile. But as she burst out into the cool Seoul night and signaled for a taxi, she knew that the silence was over. Yeo Soo Bin hadn't just married into his world to please his family. He had built a throne on a lie. And today, looking into the eyes of the heir he never knew he had, that throne had turned to ash. She climbed into the back of the car, pulling Leo into her lap. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, she looked back at the golden lights of the hotel. A dark figure had emerged from the entrance, standing alone under the grand awning. It was Soo Bin. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket anymore. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and even from the distance of the moving car, Carrie could see the desperation in his silhouette. He didn't chase the car. He didn't scream. He simply stood there, watching her disappear into the city, a man who had finally realized that the heart he left behind was the only thing that could ever truly make him a king. The taxi ride back to the apartment was a blur of neon lights and the frantic thrumming of Carrie's pulse. She ushered Leo inside, her hands trembling as she helped him out of his suit. She didn't tell him why they had fled. She didn't have the words to explain that the man on the stage was the reason for the missing branch of his family tree. She simply tucked him into bed, kissing his forehead with a lingering, desperate fervency, and waited. She didn't have to wait long. 8 minutes after she had walked through her front door, a heavy, rhythmic pounding shook the wood. It wasn't the knock of a visitor. It was the demand of a man reclaiming something he had lost. Carrie opened the door, and the air in the small hallway seemed to vanish. Subin stood there, framed by the dim amber light of the corridor. He looked like a fallen king. His tuxedo jacket was gone. His white silk shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and the cuff of his right sleeve was stained a dark, rusty crimson where the glass had sliced his palm. He didn't look at the wound. He didn't look at the modest furniture of her living room. He looked only at her, his narrow almond eyes burning with a mixture of agony and accusation. "How long?" he rasped. He didn't step inside. He hovered on the threshold as if he feared the very air of her home would undo him. "How long have you been hiding my son, Carrie?" "I wasn't hiding him, Subin," Carrie snapped, her voice cracking but holding its ground. She crossed her arms, a shield against the sheer intensity of his presence. "I was living the life you left me to live. You vanished. No note, no call, just a headline 6 months later saying you were engaged to a woman who happened to be my stepsister. What was I supposed to do? Send a baby shower invite to the Yeo Manor?" The mention of the marriage made Subin flinch as if she had struck him. He finally stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with a finality that made the walls feel smaller. He moved toward her, and for a second, Carrie wanted to shrink back, but the memory of his betrayal kept her spine straight. "You think I wanted that?" he whispered, his voice dropping into a dangerous, vibrating register. He held up his blood-stained hand, gesturing vaguely toward the city outside. "You think I woke up one day and decided that a life with a woman I despise was better than the one I had with you? You chose it," she whispered. "You chose the crown. You chose your world. I chose your life," he roared, the sudden volume making Carrie jump. He immediately lowered his voice, casting a haunted glance toward Leo's closed bedroom door. He stepped closer, so close she could smell the expensive champagne and the metallic tang of blood. "My father found out about us, Carrie. Not just that I was seeing someone, but that I was seeing you. An outsider. A woman they couldn't control. They didn't just want me back, they wanted you erased. Permanent élimination." Carrie felt a cold shiver crawl down her spine. "So, you married Subin to save me?" "I married her to buy time," he said, his eyes searching hers with a desperate need for her to understand. "I married a woman from my world to please my family, to put a shield of tradition around my name so they would stop looking into my past. I thought if I gave them the perfect bride, the perfect alliance, they would leave you in the shadows where you'd be safe. I spent 6 years building a throne of corpses just so I could finally have enough power to kill the men who threatened you." He reached out, his wounded hand hovering near her face, hesitant to touch her. "I thought I was sacrificing my happiness to keep you alive. I didn't know I was leaving my heart and my heir with a woman they rejected. I didn't know I was missing his first steps, his first words." A single tear escaped Carrie's eye, tracing a path through her golden undertones. The anger was still there, but it was being drowned out by the crushing weight of his noble betrayal. He hadn't left her because she wasn't enough. He had left her because she was everything. "The blood on your sleeve," she whispered, looking at his hand, "and the blood on her dress. It's nothing," he dismissed, finally closing the gap and cupping her cheek. His skin was cold, but his touch was electric. "The moment I saw him, Carrie, the world I built turned to ash. The alliance, the marriage, the traditions, none of it matters. My father saw him. He knows, and he will come for the boy. I won't let him," Carrie vowed, her protective instinct flaring. "Neither will I," Subin said, his focused gaze turning lethal. "But you can't stay here. This apartment is a paper fortress. You're coming with me. To the estate. To the house where your wife lives?" Carrie asked, a bitter laugh escaping her. Subin leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, the particular way he used to do when they were just two people in love, not a mafia boss and a secret. "She's a wife in name and a signature on a contract. You are the mother of the Yeo heir. And from this moment on, anyone who stands between me and my family, including my own father, is already dead." The rejected woman was no longer an outsider. She was the focal point of a war that had been brewing for 6 years. As Subin looked toward the bedroom where his son slept, the noble sacrifice was over. The era of the true king had begun. The black sedan glided through the iron gates of the Yeo estate, a sprawling fortress of glass and dark stone nestled in the hills of Pyeongchang-dong. For Carrie, the transition from her cramped apartment to this cold, architectural masterpiece felt like being swallowed by a beautiful predator. As they stepped into the vaulted foyer, the silence was broken only by the rhythmic clicking of heels on polished obsidian. Kim Soo-bin stood at the base of the grand staircase, still draped in the ruins of her bridal finery. The champagne stains on her gown had dried into ugly, jagged patches, and her eyes, once filled with an oblivious, bright smile, were now sharp with a realization that bordered on frantic. She looked at Soo-bin, then at Carrie, and finally at the boy. "You brought them here," the stepsister whispered, her voice trembling not with fear, but with the indignation of a woman who had just realized she was a supporting character in her own marriage. "Into our home? Soo-bin, my father's already calling. The elders are demanding an explanation for the scene you made at the Hyatt." Soo-bin didn't stop walking. He kept his hand firmly on the small of Carrie's back, guiding her forward with a possessiveness that was a declaration of war. "They can wait," he said, his voice as cold as the marble beneath them. "Carrie and Leo will be staying in the East Wing indefinitely. Ensure the staff understands that their safety is the only priority." "The East Wing is for the matriarch," Kim Soo-bin hissed, her gaze snapping to Carrie with a lethal intensity. "I am your wife, Soo-bin. We signed the papers. We held this ceremony. You cannot simply install your past in the heart of this house." Soo-bin stopped then, turning to face his bride with a look of profound indifference. "We signed a contract, Soo-bin-ah. You wanted the title of the Yeo daughter-in-law to secure your father's business interests. You have it, but do not confuse a political shell with a marriage. I told you from the start that my heart was already occupied. You just didn't believe me until you saw the proof standing in front of you." The air in the foyer turned frigid. Carrie felt like a ghost haunting a palace that wasn't hers, yet she stood taller, her hand tightening around Leo's. She saw the flash of humiliation in her stepsister's eyes, the realization that despite the diamonds and the silk, she was the outsider and the rejected woman was the one who held the key to the king's legacy. As the servants moved in a silent, choreographed dance to take their bags, Soo-bin leaned toward Carrie. "The staff will bring dinner to your rooms. Don't leave the East Wing tonight. My father's men are already patrolling the perimeter, and I need time to clear the board." "Soo-bin," Carrie whispered, looking at the opulence around her that felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. "She hates me. She's going to look at Leo every day and see the reason her life is a lie." "Let her look," Soo-bin replied, his eyes softening only for a microsecond before hardening back into the lethal gaze of a mafia boss. "She is a guest in the house you were supposed to rule. Sleep, Carrie. Tomorrow, the world finds out that the Yeo heir has returned." He turned and walked toward his study, leaving the two queens standing in the cavernous hall. Kim Soo-bin didn't move. She watched him go, then turned her gaze back to Carrie. There was no more pretend sweetness, no more family loyalty. There was only the cold, hard calculation of a woman whose throne was built on sand. "You think you've won because you have his blood," the stepsister said, her voice dropping to a low, venomous thread. "But this world eats mothers like you for breakfast. You've brought a storm into this house, Soo-bin," Al-Hwan began, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that didn't need to be loud to be terrifying. He didn't look at Carrie. To him, she was a ghost, a momentary lapse in his son's judgment. His eyes were fixed solely on Leo, a storm that threatens the stability of everything we've built. The elders are whispering about mixed blood and bastard heirs. I will not have the Yeo legacy questioned. "He is my son," Soo-bin said, his voice flat and dangerous. He stepped in front of the table, shielding Leo from his grandfather's predatory gaze. "There is no question. In our world, blood is the only truth," the patriarch countered. He gestured to the doctor. The test will be conducted now. If the boy is indeed of our line, he will be moved to the main house immediately. He will begin his training. He will be raised as a Yeo, stripped of the influences that have softened him. Carrie stood up so abruptly her chair scraped harshly against the floor. He is not a project, she said, her voice trembling with a mother's protective rage. And he is not going anywhere without me. The patriarch finally turned his gaze toward her. It was like being stared down by a cobra. You were a mistake my son made in his youth. A distraction. You have no standing here, Ms. Rempel. If the boy is ours, we will compensate you for your time, and you will return to the world you belong in. The Yeo heir does not need an outsider mother. Subin's jaw tightened so hard a muscle in his cheek ticked. He turned to look at Carrie, and for a fleeting second, she saw the noble sacrifice flicker in his eyes again, the urge to push her away to keep her safe. But then he looked at Leo, who was watching the exchange with an eerie, calm intelligence, and Subin's resolve shifted into something far more permanent. He stays with his mother, Subin stated, each word a hammer blow. And she stays with me. You would risk a civil war within the syndicate for a woman who brings nothing to the table. Ailhuan asked, his eyes narrowing. Your wife's family is already threatening to pull their investments. You're choosing a ghost over a kingdom. I'm choosing the only truth I've ever had, Subin replied. He looked at the doctor, then back at his father. We will do the test. Not because I doubt his blood, but because I want it written in the family scrolls so that no one, not even you, can ever challenge his right to my throne. But understand this, father. If you try to separate them, if you try to discard the woman I chose, I will burn this kingdom to the ground before I let you rule it. The patriarch stared at his son, searching for a bluff and finding only a lethal certainty. With a curt nod, he signaled the doctor forward. Carrie watched, her heart thumping against her ribs like a trapped bird as the doctor knelt beside Leo. The boy didn't flinch. He looked at Subin, and Subin gave him a single, infinitesimal nod of encouragement. As the swab touched the inside of Leo's cheek, the room felt like a vacuum. The test was a formality for the heart, but a death warrant for their peace. As the doctor sealed the vial, the patriarch turned to leave, pausing only to cast one last look at Carrie. The results will be ready by evening, Ailhuan said. Pray they're negative, Ms. Rempel, because if that boy is a Yeo, your life as you know it is over. You will be nothing but a shadow in the halls of his greatness. When the doors closed behind them, the silence that followed was suffocating. Carrie looked at Subin, who was still standing like a sentinel between her and the world. He's going to take him, isn't he? She whispered. Subin turned, reaching out to take her hands. His palms were warm, grounding her in the midst of the chaos. He married me to a shell to please the family, Subin said, repeating the mantra of his regret. But he forgot that a king is nothing without his heart. He thinks he's testing Leo's blood, but he's actually testing mine. And he has no idea how far I'm willing to go to keep you both. The legacy test had begun, and as the sun climbed higher over the fortress, Carrie realized she was no longer just an outsider. She was the prize in a war where the stakes were her son's soul and the heart of the man who had never truly let her go. The evening rain began to lash against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the East Wing, blurring the lights of Seoul into a smear of neon and gray. Inside, the silence was heavy, broken only by the soft click of the door as Subin entered. He had discarded his tie, and his white shirt was unbuttoned at the throat, revealing the jagged edge of a scar Carrie had never seen before. She was standing by the window, her reflection a pale ghost against the glass. She didn't turn when he approached. The weight of the DNA test results, which had come back an hour ago with a staggering 99.9% certainty, sat between them like an unexploded bomb. Leo is asleep, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He asked if you were going to be at breakfast tomorrow. He started to look for you in the hallways, Subin. He's starting to expect you. Subin stopped a few feet behind her. He didn't reach out. The space between them was filled with 6 years of unsaid things, a vacuum that felt like it was crushing the air out of the room. "I'll be there," he promised, his voice low and thick with a sudden, raw emotion. "I'll be there every morning for the rest of his life, if you let me." "How can I let you?" Carrie turned then, her almond-shaped eyes bright with unshed tears. "You're married to my sister. You live in a fortress surrounded by men with guns. You tell me you left to save me, but all I felt was the hole you left behind. I spent 6 years wondering if I was just a summer distraction that got too complicated for a Mafia prince." Subin moved then, crossing the distance in 2 strides. He didn't grab her. He placed his hands on the window frame on either side of her, pinning her within the circle of his presence. The intensity in his gaze was enough to make her heart stutter. "A distraction?" he repeated, a bitter, pained laugh escaping him. "Carrie, I didn't just leave. I tore my own soul out so I could leave you with a chance to breathe. When my father found those photos of us in Paris, when he told me that your life was the price of my rebellion, I realized I had no weapons to fight him. I was a prince with no army." He leaned in closer, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. It was the same gesture from the apartment, the one that broke her defenses every single time. "I chose the crown for you," he whispered against her skin. "Every cold calculation, every brutal order I gave, every night I spent sitting in that boardroom with a woman I couldn't stand to touch. It was all for you. I needed the chairmanship. I needed the absolute loyalty of the captains. Because I knew that the only way I could ever bring you back into the light was if I owned the light itself." "And the marriage?" Carrie asked, her voice trembling. "Was that part of the light too?" "The marriage was the ultimate armor," Subin confessed, his eyes searching hers with a desperate, naked honesty. "By marrying into your family, I created a web of legal and financial ties that made it impossible for my father to strike at you without destroying his own fortune. I made your stepsister a shield. I knew she was greedy. I knew she wanted the status. I gave it to her so she would inadvertently protect the only thing I actually valued. I chose a queen of glass so I could eventually come back for my queen of gold." He reached out then, his thumb tracing the curve of her lower lip. "I have spent 2,000 days waiting for the moment I was powerful enough to stop running. I thought I was being noble. I thought I was being a martyr. But today when I saw Leo, when I realized I had missed the birth of my own son because I was too busy playing king." He choked back a sob, his composure finally fracturing. "I realized I didn't save you, Carrie. I just stole 6 years of our lives." Carrie looked at him, this powerful, lethal man who was currently trembling in the dark of his own palace. She realized then that the rejected narrative wasn't just about the family rejecting her. It was about Subin rejecting his own happiness to ensure her survival. He hadn't traded her for a crown. He had stolen the crown so he could give her the world. "The test results mean the patriarch won't stop," she whispered, reaching up to cup his face. "He wants the heir. He doesn't want me." "Then he has already lost," Subin said, his gaze turning back into the lethal, focused mask of the boss. "Because he doesn't realize that the heir and the mother are the same heart. And he certainly doesn't realize that I am no longer the boy he can threaten. I am the man who has already sacrificed everything once. I won't do it a second time." He leaned down, his lips finally meeting hers in a kiss that tasted of rain, salt, and 6 years of starved longing. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a reclamation. In the silent halls of the Yeo estate, the ghost in the palace was finally taking a breath of real air. The crown was heavy, but as Subin pulled her closer, he looked like a man who had finally found the only treasure worth guarding. The battle for the legacy was far from over, but for the first time in half a decade, Carrie wasn't standing in the shadows alone. She was standing in the heart of the empire, and the king was on his knees before her. The silence of the East Wing was deceptive, a fragile layer of glass over a darkening abyss. While Carrie and Subin found a fleeting, rain-slicked sanctuary in each other's arms, Kim Subin paced the length of the main house, her footsteps echoing like the ticking of a countdown. The dried champagne on her bridal gown felt like a brand of shame, a physical reminder that she had been discarded in front of the very world she had sacrificed everything to impress. She stopped in front of the ornate vanity in her bedroom, staring at her reflection. She saw the perfect skin, the expensive dark brown hair, and the eyes that had been trained since birth to look for the next move on the chessboard. But behind her, through the doorway, she could see the empty side of the bed. Subin hadn't even entered the room. He was in the East Wing, breathing the same air as the woman who had ruined her life. "He thinks I'm a shell," she whispered to the empty room, her voice a sharp, jagged thing. "He thinks he can keep his heart in one wing and his crown in the other." A cold, calculating fury settled over her. She knew the Yeo Syndicate. She knew that the only thing more powerful than blood was the threat of losing it. If the mixed-race heir existed, her marriage was dead. If the boy stayed alive, she would be a footnote in the history of the black woman who had stolen the king. She reached for her phone, her fingers steady despite the rage burning in her chest. She didn't call her father. She didn't call the patriarch. They were bound by the same dynastic rules that had trapped her. Instead, she dialed a number that was never supposed to be on a Yeo daughter's call log. It was a number that belonged to the shadows, to the Kong organization, the bitter rivals who had been looking for a crack in the Yeo armor for decades. "I have something you want," she said when the line clicked open, her voice devoid of any familial loyalty. "A secret that makes the Yeo line vulnerable. A child, the only heir Yeo Subin will ever acknowledge." The silence on the other end was predatory. "And why would the new bride of the Yeo family give us such a prize?" "Because the bride is a ghost," she replied, her eyes narrowing as she watched the lights of the East Wing through her window. "And I would rather see this kingdom burn than see her sit on the throne." She hit send on a secondary file, a photo she had snapped from the security feed earlier that day. It was a grainy, high-contrast image of Leo sitting at the breakfast table, his profile an unmistakable match for the man she was supposed to call husband. Beside the photo, she included the address of the private school Leo had attended before the reunion, and the coordinates of the East Wing's secondary exit. The betrayal felt like a clean, sharp cut. By leaking Leo's existence to the Kong gang, she wasn't just erasing the competition. She was inviting a wolf into the house to kill the cub. If Leo was taken, if the scandal became a bloodbath, the patriarch would have no choice but to eliminate the distraction entirely. Subin would be forced back to her side to lead the retaliation, and the black woman would be nothing more than a tragic memory. She put the phone down, her heart racing with a sick, exhilarating power. She walked to the window, watching the rain wash away the dust from the estate's driveway. In the distance, she saw the headlights of a black SUV idling just outside the perimeter. The Kangs were fast. They were hungry. "You should have stayed in the shadows, Carrie," she murmured, a small, terrifying smile finally returning to her face. "You should have kept your heart and your air where they belonged. Because in this world, the only thing that survives a fire is the crown." As she turned to begin unzipping her ruined wedding dress, the first tremor of the coming storm hit. A silent alarm tripped in the security booth, a flicker of movement in the woods that bordered the East Wing. Kim Subin didn't call for help. She simply sat on the edge of her bed and waited for the sound of the first glass breaking. The accepted woman had just opened the gates to the abyss, and she was more than happy to watch her family fall into it, as long as she was the last one standing. The transition from silence to chaos was instantaneous. One moment, the East Wing was a sanctuary of hushed whispers and rain against glass. The next, the sharp, percussive crack of a tactical breach shattered the night. The Kong organization didn't come with a polite knock. They came like a flood through the secondary exit Kim Subin had so precisely mapped for them. Subin was out of bed before the first alarm siren could fully wail. His instincts, honed by a decade of looking over his shoulder, transformed him into the lethal Commander Carey had only seen in glimpses. He grabbed his handgun from the bedside safe, his eyes meeting Carey's in the dark, a silent command for her to get to Leo. "Don't stop for anything," he hissed, his voice like grinding stones. "Go to the armored bay." I'm right behind you. The hallways were a blur of motion. Shadows moved in the periphery, the staccato rhythm of suppressed gunfire echoing through the marble corridors of the estate. Subin's security detail engaged the intruders in the foyer, but the Kangs were surgical. They weren't there to take the house. They were there to take the air. Outside, the rain had turned into a torrential downpour, turning the estate's winding driveway into a slick, treacherous ribbon of asphalt. Subin threw Carrie and a wide-eyed Leo into the back of a reinforced black SUV, his bloodied hand gripping the steering wheel as he floored the accelerator. But as they neared the main gates, a white sedan, the one Kim Subin had used to flee the main house moments earlier, was forced off the road by two Kong vehicles. The car was crumpled against a stone pillar, steam hissing from the radiator. Kim Subin was visible through the shattered windshield, her face a mask of terror, trapped as a Kong gunman approached her door with a crowbar. Subin! Carrie screamed from the back seat, clutching Leo to her chest. It's your wife. They have Subin. Subin's gaze flickered to the rearview mirror. He saw the woman he had married to please his family, the woman who represented the accepted world being dragged from the wreckage. He saw the gunman look toward the SUV, realizing the real prize was getting away. For a heartbeat, the noble sacrifice he had practiced for 6 years warred with the primal truth of his heart. If he stopped to save the stepsister, he would be trapped. The Kangs would surround the SUV, and Leo would be lost. If he kept driving, his official wife would likely pay the ultimate price for a betrayal she had orchestrated. He didn't hesitate. He didn't even tap the brakes. Subin, you have to help her. Carrie cried out, the horror of the violence overriding her own rivalry. I can only save one world tonight, Carrie, Subin growled, his jaw set in a line of iron. He swung the wheel, ramming through the Kong blockade at the gate with a deafening roar of grinding metal. And I'm not losing the only one that matters. In the mirror, the image of his bride grew smaller, a ghost in a ruined wedding dress screaming into the rain, as Subin pushed the engine to its limit. He had spent 6 years making choices for the syndicate, for the crown, and for the expectations of a father who didn't love him. But as he looked at Carrie's reflection, the woman they had rejected, the woman who held his son, he knew he had finally stopped being a prince. The high-speed extraction was a blur of screeching tires and narrow misses through the mountain passes. The Kong vehicles pursued them like hungry wolves, but Subin drove with a desperation that bordered on the supernatural. He navigated the hairpin turns of the Seoul outskirts, his mind already 3 moves ahead. She's my sister, Subin, Carrie whispered, her voice trembling as the adrenaline began to crash. Even after everything, you just left her. I left a stranger, Subin replied, his voice devoid of regret. I married her to protect you. If protecting you means the world thinks I'm a monster, then let them think it. I am done with half answers and curated truths. From now on, there's only us. He reached out his right hand, the one still stained with his own blood from the reunion, and squeezed Carrie's knee. The heat of his touch was the only grounding thing in a world that had just turned into a war zone. Behind them, the lights of the pursuers finally faded as Subin dove into the labyrinthine tunnels of the city. He had made his choice. The official wife was a casualty of a war she had started, but the rejected woman was finally, unmistakably, the only queen he would ever serve. As Leo fell into a fitful sleep against Carrie's shoulder, Subin realized that by choosing the mother of his heir over the bride of his status, he hadn't just saved his family. He had finally declared war on his own bloodline. The extraction was complete, but the coronation was just beginning. The safe house was a concrete needle in the heart of Seoul's industrial district, a place where the air tasted of salt and diesel. Subin stood by the heavy steel door, his silhouette framed by the harsh, flickering light of a single overhead bulb. He had spent the last 3 hours on a secure line, his voice a low, rhythmic murmur as he dismantled the very world he had spent 6 years building. When he finally turned back to the room, his eyes were hollow but determined. Carrie sat on the edge of a narrow cot, holding a sleeping Leo. The boy's face was peaceful, oblivious to the fact that his father had just burned a billion-dollar alliance to cinders to keep him safe. "It's done," Su-bin said, his voice sounding like it had been dragged through gravel. "I've initiated the dissolution of the marriage. My lawyers are filing the papers under irreconcilable threat. By tomorrow morning, the news of the Kong breach and the sham wedding will be the only thing the syndicate can talk about." The door to the safe house groaned open, and Yeo Huan, the patriarch, stepped in. He wasn't accompanied by a doctor this time, but by two grim-faced captains whose hands hovered near their jackets. The old man looked around the dingy room with a sneer of profound disgust. "You've retreated to a hole in the ground for a woman who has already cost us our strongest alliance." Huan spat, his gaze landing on Carrie with a lethal coldness. "The Kangs are in retreat, but the damage is done. Your wife's father is pulling his shares. You have weakened the throne, Su-bin. All for a child of mixed blood and a mother who belongs in the gutters of a different continent." Su-bin stepped forward, the space between him and his father shrinking until they were inches apart. He didn't look like a prince anymore. He looked like a god of war who had finally found something worth fighting for. "You speak of blood as if it's a currency, Father," Su-bin said, his voice vibrating with a decade of repressed rage. "But you forgot the most important rule of the Yeo line. We protect what is ours. You sent me away 6 years ago. You forced me to reject the only heart that ever beat for me. You made me marry a woman who just tried to have my son murdered by our rivals. She acted for the stability of a name," the patriarch roared. "She acted for a crown that no longer exists," Su-bin countered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, blood-stained digital recorder, the one his security team had recovered from the main house's surveillance hub. He pressed play. Kim Su-bin's voice, cold and treacherous as she coordinated with the Kangs, filled the small room. The patriarch's face went pale, the realization of his daughter-in-law's betrayal hitting him like a physical blow. "I'm a chairman now," Su-bin said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, quiet steel. "I have the loyalty of the captains who watched you allow a child to be hunted in your own home. I have officially dissolved the marriage. From this moment on, Kim Su-bin is persona non grata in this city. And as for the legacy..." He turned, reaching out his hand to Carrie. She took it, her warm skin a stark contrast to the cold metal and stone around them. Su-bin pulled her to his side, his arm locking around her waist in a gesture of absolute, unshakable ownership. "Look at her, Father," Su-bin commanded. "Look at the woman you rejected, because she is the only woman who will ever bear the Yeo name. She is the mother of the heir, and she is the only queen this syndicate will ever serve. If any man, including you, so much as whispers a word against her, they're declaring war on me." The patriarch looked at Carrie, seeing not a distraction anymore, but a woman who had survived the worst of their world and come out standing beside the most powerful man in it. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire that now burned in his son. He realized then that the noble sacrifice was over. Su-bin hadn't just saved Carrie. He had replaced the old world with a new one. "You are throwing away centuries of tradition for her," Huan whispered, his voice sounding old for the first time. "No," Su-bin replied, his gaze fixing on the sleeping boy on the cot. "I am finally starting a tradition worth keeping." He signaled to the captains. They didn't move to stop him. They bowed. The shift in power was complete. The patriarch was a ghost of the past, and the rejected woman was now the focal point of the future. As Su-bin led Carrie and Leo toward the exit, the industrial safe house felt like the birthplace of an empire. The crown was heavy, but for the first time in 6 years, Su-bin wasn't carrying it alone. He had his heart, he had his heir, and he had the only woman who had ever truly known the man behind the mask. The morning sun over Seoul didn't just rise. It reclaimed the city, gilding the glass towers and ancient temple roofs in a light that felt new. For Carrie, the view from the penthouse balcony of the Yeo headquarters was no longer the sight of a beautiful predator's cage. It was the view of her home. The air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of the city beginning its day. Inside the suite, the quiet was no longer heavy with secrets, but light with the ease of a life finally allowed to exist in the open. Carrie adjusted the lapels of her tailored cream blazer, her reflection in the glass showing a woman who had transitioned from a shadow to a sun. Her dark auburn hair was styled in soft, elegant waves, and her eyes held a calm, ironclad certainty. She was no longer the outsider lurking at the edges of a ballroom. She was the woman whose presence now defined the center of the room. Subin stepped onto the balcony, moving with a grace that was no longer burdened by the noble sacrifice. He wore a suit of deep charcoal, but his collar was open, his posture relaxed. He didn't look like a man guarding a throne. He looked like a man who had finally found peace. He walked behind her, his arms sliding around her waist, his chin resting in the crook of her neck. "The board is waiting," he whispered, his breath warm against her skin. "The announcement is scheduled for 10. By noon, every branch of the syndicate and every business partner in the country will know that the YEO chairmanship is now a partnership." "And your father?" Carrie asked, leaning back into his strength. "My father is retired to the countryside," Subin said, and for the first time, there was no bitterness in his voice, only a clean, final closure. He finally realized that a legacy without love is just a very expensive grave. He saw Leo this morning. He didn't try to take him. He just watched him. I think he finally saw the fire in the boy's eyes and realized it didn't come from the Yeo name. It came from you. A small, energetic blur of movement interrupted them. Leo burst onto the balcony, his feet thumping happily on the wood. He was dressed for his first day at the prestigious International Academy Subin had hand-selected, a place where his heritage was celebrated, not managed. He looked between his mother and father, his face breaking into that enormous, uncontainable smile that had been the only light in Carrie's world for 6 years. "Is it time?" Leo asked, his dark eyes bright with the thrill of the new. Subin knelt eye level with his son and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. It was a gesture of guidance, not control. "It's time, Leo. Today, we go into the city as a family. No more back doors. No more secret apartments. You walk through the front gate." Subin stood and reached for Carrie's hand. As they walked through the penthouse and toward the private elevator that would take them to the lobby, where the press and the captains waited, the weight of the last 6 years finally lifted. The coronation wasn't about a crown or a title. It was the moment they stepped out into the lobby of the Yeo building, and the security detail, the executives, and the onlookers all went silent. Subin didn't walk ahead of her. He walked beside her, their hands interlaced, with Leo leading the way. He married someone from his world to please his family, but he had come back for the woman they rejected. And in doing so, he had proven that worldly duty was a ghost compared to the heartbeat of a mother and the eyes of an heir. As the flashbulbs began to pop and the cameras rolled, Carrie didn't blink. She looked directly into the lens, a black woman standing at the pinnacle of a Korean empire, not as a guest, but as its soul. The heart had won. The shadows were gone. And as Subin leaned in to whisper a private joke to his son, Carrie knew that the real story, their true legacy, was only just beginning.